I invited technically and formally the heads of every single political party in the United Kingdom to send either representation or a letter. Alex Salmond, at least had the courtesy to think very carefully about coming and then decided not to, but wishing us well. Ed Miliband, the leader of the Labour Party, likewise, sent a personal message, well wishes for the meeting. But they have not sent any actual evidence to us about Labour Party policy on Trident, and likewise the other parties haven't really responded. So, but I will be pursuing this by the time we come to next year and have another seminar. But so, as I've said earlier about my work as a philosopher globally, this is the local patch, isn't it? And so we can think through some of the global issues that affect other countries, Europe, Ireland. And I'm also Canadian, I'm a dual citizen, British Canadian, so I have an interest from a Commonwealth perspective. So firstly, I just want to say, what is Trident? The idea of calling this the Poseidon Seminars is because, as a Druid, I'm interested in the ancient wisdom traditions. Poseidon was the personification of the force of the sea. The sea is one of the most huge powers known to mankind. Britain is a tiny series of islands, Britain and Ireland, and we have, a very powerful and great navy. The song Rule Britannia, which is the theme tune of Britain, the last verse of that song invokes Britain's sort of martial energy as a home for the muses and for the power of freedom. If you don't know the last song of Rule Britannia, the last verse, it's never sung. It basically says that these islands are dedicated to preserving freedom and the muses. Now, the question I'm sort of asking today is, how is that best done? Is it going to be best done by nuclear weapons, continuing down that route? In a world of increasing nuclear proliferation? Or is there some other route? And if so, what could that be? Trident is a nuclear missile system that is American manufacture, which we kind of import. We've acquired use of that technology at great cost and expense. And it's the symbolic weapon of Poseidon, who wields it, or Neptune. I suppose, philosophically, what I'm going to argue is that if we could actually ask Poseidon, are we supposed to be using this Trident weapon? Or is there maybe some other way of defending these islands and establishing international order and peace and a civilized global community? That's the question we should ask, I think. The history of Britain's nuclear deterrent is interesting. Obviously it goes back to the late 40s, secret decisions made in cabinet to acquire nuclear weapons. Britain's scientific community had helped with the thinking behind the bomb. The Manhattan Project in the States, a lot of British scientists worked on, collaborated. And one of the problems with nuclear weapons technology is that it involves some very intelligent people, historically, who are able to argue their case towards government that they need backing support. If you've not seen a film called The Shadowmakers with Paul Newman, it's a really good film. It's about the history of the Manhattan Project. And I saw it at a Pugwash screening, because I have involvement with Pugwash, who won the Nobel Peace Prize some years ago. Joseph Rotblat was a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project. But Einstein, who kick-started the whole thing, disagreed with the development of nuclear weapons, certainly at the end of World War II. And he helped set up Pugwash with Bertrand Russell. So, I think Einstein's witness to peace is something that I believe in. So what are we doing with what's being proposed about Trident? Okay. Basically, it's a proposal to replace the existing Vanguard class of 4 Trident ballistic missile armed submarines with a new class of submarine designed to continue a nuclear deterrent after the current boats reach the end of their service lives. So it's based on a white paper in 2006 commissioned by Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister to think through the long-term defence needs of Britain. And he argued that it's important to start planning for that and thinking that through then, in 2006. And he set in motion the bureaucratic machinery to make that planning happen. And in the foreword to that white paper, Tony Blair said the following. He said, "Delaying a decision would risk a future break in our deterrent protection. These are not decisions the government takes lightly. The financial costs are substantial. We would not want to have available the terrifying power of these weapons unless we believed that to be necessary to deter a future aggressor." The government's decision followed a careful review of all the issues and options which are set out in full in this white paper. We look forward to a substantial period of public and parliamentary debate in which the issues can be aired freely. But I am confident that the debate will only confirm that maintaining our nuclear deterrent is in the best interests of the country's future security. Right, Tony Blair, 2006. Well, this is part of that debate. He called for a full, open public debate. That's what we're trying to do. He also says that that basically those who wish to argue that it's possible to have security without nuclear weapons, then the onus is on them to convince, the powers that be that we can guarantee security without the traditional nuclear deterrents. So I want to take these challenges on head on, right? There's no point ignoring them. One of the other questions that has to be addressed is the question of cost, right? The economics of all this. Because in 2006, Britain's economy looked relatively healthy. Okay, the global economy looked reasonably healthy. There was a lot of money in the bank, it was thought. In 2011, 5 years down the road, the country is pretty much struggling to just stay afloat with its normal expenditure needs. And the same in Europe, and in America, and globally, there's been a huge economic crisis since then. So I think there's one of the biggest arguments against expenditure on refitting Trident is the costs involved, which are estimated to be about £100 billion, which is a vast sum of money if you think about it. The costs involved in... Now, to me, that's all dead money. I'm really interested in economics. I've shown you the Castle Room to do with economics. I've been reading Adam Smith recently and just went to Kirkcaldy, where he wrote The Wealth of Nations. Now, to me, spending vast amounts of your capital as a nation on the capacity to blow up and destroy, other countries and peoples, I don't think it makes economic sense. That amount of money, £100 billion, could solve the economic problems of this country, and the costs of savings, if they were rescheduled to things like alternative energy research, solving the transport problems of this country, solving our long-term energy needs, doing the kind of high-energy physics that's needed to make breakthroughs into alternative energy sources, nuclear fusion possibly, alternatives to the current fossil fuels, thinking through a green, economics would be opened up by releasing that kind of funding and expenditure, it seems to me. Also, it's worth saying that in a Defence Select Committee meeting in the House of Commons on the 23rd of January 2007, a US nuclear expert, Richard Garwin, lambasted the plans for Trident and said that the plans were premature and wasteful. And he even said that the decision, if you delayed the decision for 15 years, you could simply have inexpensive engine repairs to keep the current things floating. It would save £5 billion off that huge total. But he also added that the pressure to commission a new fleet of submarines was rooted in the shipbuilding's industry urge to land lucrative contracts. Now that's the American defense expert saying that it's not even necessary, right? It's just It's just sort of, it would guarantee a few jobs for a few shipbuilders. I don't know, one of my ancestors sailed on the HMS Victory, you know. I mean, I have some naval blood in me, and I don't think any right-thinking naval person would say that, you know, it's worth spending £100 billion just to keep a few shipbuilders in work. You know, they can build ships anyway. You know, we could spend some of that money on you know, rebuilding some passenger cruise lines or whatever. I'd quite like to get a boat to Canada from Glasgow. You know, let's get the old Cunard ships floating again. Cost argument, I think, is very important, and I can't see these sums adding up. You know, if economists want to come here and argue that it's a really good investment for Britain now in 2011, then let them. You know, I can't see it myself. I don't think Adam Smith would have thought it was a good investment. Okay, let's just ask, what are the time frames involved? Well, basically, we're talking quite long-term time frames here. And that's why the thinking that's going into it at the moment, they're thinking of replacement coming in the 2020s. So by already planning to re-equip these submarines and their missiles, it would be long-term. So that's a problem, because this generation, I mean, we have to think ahead by 2020, what will the world look like? You know, if Britain decided to go down the route of a non-nuclear defence strategy and take the Swedish model, say, or the Swiss model. I used to work with an organisation in London called Just Defence, which argued that Britain's defence industry should be based simply on that, defence. We needed a good defensive force capable to deter aggression. But that's it, you know. And that would involve descaling down the whole military operation of this country. You know, if Britain took a route something like that, then how can we predict what the world will be like in 10 or 20 years from now? And I think the arguments for the pro-nuclear weapons lobby are that the world is so dangerous and destabilised. And, you know, there are rogue states out there. Many of them have access to nuclear weapons that, as a safety precaution, we need to keep them. It's the kind of caution principle. My concern with that is it's kind of like negative prophecy. Okay, as a druid and as a philosopher, I'm very interested in the future. As an academic, I do future studies. I do believe that we co-create the kind of future we want to live in. And I do think that if we all know this from our personal lives, if we think the worst and plan for it, it tends to happen. I do think we humans have the capacity for creative, imaginal co-creation of a more peaceful planet in a more you know, enlightened place. I personally would like to plan ahead for, you know, in 20 years' time, a much higher level of enlightenment, of educational achievement, of literacy, of emotional and spiritual literacy on the planet, of economic needs being fulfilled, of gender imbalances being sorted out, of an ending of not just war, but also domestic abuse, violence, you know, rape, the kind of economic violence that goes on the planet, which protesters are all over the planet at the moment protesting about. So I'd like to help co-create by visioning a world of peace. And one of the things I'm working on is a 10-point peace plan for the planet. As a philosopher coordinating globally philosophers of peace, I do think that as a globe we need to have kind of planetary objectives, you know, to think through an alternative kind of world system. Guaranteeing peace for every person on this planet is part of that. And the expenditure for that, you know, could be met by the world opting to go non-nuclear weapons approach. There is this global zero move, non-nuclear policy, non-nuclear weapons policy at least. The argument about nuclear energy is slightly. I think just purely on rational terms, you know, if you're talking in classical economic terms, the costs of Trident don't demand, you know, such an expenditure for the kind of benefits they might give. Another argument for that is the kinds of conflicts that we now face in the world are very different to when these weapons were invented and developed and stockpiled. In those days, it was going to be a superpower conflict between the Soviet bloc, that mind game. You know, it was us against them. It was a polarized world, and it was right. Those days have long gone. I mean, I've been to Moscow in the days in the 1990s of perestroika and spoke to one of Gorbachev's advisors who was working on arms conversion. Gorbachev had appointed a guy to actually work with the Soviet arms industry because he said, we want to stop making these huge weapons. It was Gorbachev and his decision to basically end the polarized arms race that made possible the Treaty of Paris in 1990 and the ending of the Cold War in Europe. And, you know, I think we need a new 1990 moment on the planet. You know, where are the Gorbachevs? Where are the visionary statesmen of the day? Where's, you know, Obama, you know, sort of promised that. I'm not sure he's actually delivered. He was given a Nobel Prize. I'm not sure he's actually earned it. You know, look around the planet. Maybe there are some people willing to step up to the plate and say, actually, we do need a global peace plan. That is the way to solve the global economic crisis that we're all in. And that, to me, is very good banking sense. You know, invest in peace and peace industry of the future, high tech as well as low tech. That's a much better bet for planet Earth than 100 million on new Trident. Okay, what are the politics involved? Politics is a disappointing game. I don't know if any of you have ever spent time with politicians and so on. One of my big problems is parties. I mean, I'm a believer in joined-up thinking and vision and political vision. I just do political philosophy and, you know, in the old days, Druids appointed kings and monarchs. We don't do party politics as such. But I do love politicians because at least they bother, they care, they go there and debate. I've organised 30 meetings in Parliament. So, but the problem is they have to think in committees. The problem with political structures is they're like Lilliputians. They're not allowed to actually think independently and be statesmen. They have to, oh, I can't say anything about that because I don't know what the committee says, or ask him, or, you know. They're afraid to actually think for themselves. But there are exceptions. Let's just run through the political parties. I mean, the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats have got a strong voice against Trident rebuilding and refitting. But, you know, the upper echelons, Nick Clegg, the governing structures, are kind of fudging it. But it is possible that the Liberal Democrats could suggest in the coalition government that there should be, for instance, a national referendum or certainly a debate on Trident. And there are some peace activists within the Liberal Democrats who would probably want that. The Conservative Party, Conservative and Unionist Party, I don't think it needs to be 100% historically always pro-nuclear. I think there's enough intelligent Conservatives around now, a new generation of them, sort of Cameronians, who actually are clever enough to realise it's not in the economic interests of Britain to go on fighting the Cold War with Trident. That £100 billion could actually help fulfil some of their social agenda, this notion of a big society, this idea of compassionate and caring conservatism. What I call the old school romantic conservatism of Sir Walter Scott, etc. Actually, I think he'd be turning in his grave at the thought of spending such a load of money on you know, ultimate deterrence weapons. The best deterrence is virtue. That's the kind of romantic conservative tradition. And virtue doesn't mean spending vast amounts of money you can't afford on threatening to blow to smithereens your enemy. It's about dialogue, debate, discussion. Yes, you need defence, but you know, rational defence. So I don't see myself, I think it would be possible, probably, to persuade some intelligent Conservatives and certainly Liberal Democrats to go down a non-Trident route. The Labour Party, likewise, is at crossroads. It's got a new leader. Edward Miliband seems to be much more intelligent than some previous leaders, you know, willing to rethink stuff. And I think, again, they could be persuaded that it's much more intelligent to have a non-Trident future. Although, under Tony Blair, of course, they kick-started the whole project. But I think the Labour Party's trying to grow out of Tony Blair's influence. Could be part of that project. I'm sure John Smith, who's buried not too far away from here in Iona, and who's probably here in spirit, and you know, when I was working in the House of Lords with Lord Ennals, John Smith was the Labour leader. I think that tradition of authentic Labour would I think, be intelligent enough to see the arguments against Trident's refitting. I think the Nationalist parties, Plaid Cymru and the SNP, I think both of them are making very peace-loving noises. They have an instinctive Celtic dislike of sort of organised mass violence, you know. There's a strong pacifist streak in the history of the SNP, and certainly an anti-nuclear streak, going back to its foundation. And the same with Plaid Cymru. I think their vision of you know, a decentralised United Kingdom of a patchwork of cultures and peoples living in harmony would be much more conducive to, you know, a non-nuclear kind of weapons future, the kind of funds that would be available. So I think, you know, there's some interesting developments there, and maybe we'll discuss later what the Scottish angle on this, because of course the nuclear weapons of Britain are based here in Scotland. You know, have the Scottish people ever been asked if that's a good idea? Do they want that? I think their current you know, voting shows that they probably don't want it. Okay, there is also just the political side of this to say there is an early day motion which the MPs, some MPs have put forward in Parliament, in the UK Parliament, calling for a full Trident review before the next general election. But the politics of this is that you have to get enough MPs to sign up for that. And I'm amazed that not enough have. I mean, this debate should be going on in Parliament. They should, all they're asking for is a debate on it and a review before the next election, so the parties can then look at the review, make their positions clear. Surely that's what democracy is about, you know, open debate and putting the facts before the British people. And then we can see where all the parties stand, and we can then decide what we want to vote for. That's logical. And I think, you know, every MP should sign up for that early day motion and get a full Trident review. You know, that's what our civil servants are there for. They're there to review all these issues. What about defence policy in general, the politics of that? It is complicated, and we've just learned it's subject to lobbying. As I was preparing for the seminar, I was going to invite the Ministry of Defence to send somebody, and there was a problem actually writing to the Minister of Defence, Liam Fox, who was actually then getting into trouble, you know, politically for links to a particular lobbyist, Adam Werity, who it turns out was involved in a kind of pro-Israel lobby against and briefing against the foreign minister, William Hague, to influence British foreign policy to take a very hard line against Iran, which was in sort of support of some hardline Israeli groups. So, and William Hague actually had to write to Liam Fox and say, tell your man to stop doing that briefing, right? Because I set the foreign policy of this country, not you. Now that's very interesting insight. This came out in the Sunday papers literally last weekend, right? It's just been unearthed when Liam Fox was asked or obliged to resign as Defence Minister. So, you know, who actually sets policy in this country? Is it the Defence Minister? Who actually is in charge of nuclear weapons policy? Is it the Ministry of Defence? Or is it the Foreign Secretary? Or is it the Prime Minister? Or is it the entire Cabinet? You know, that's a question for political process. It certainly shouldn't be the Defence Minister. Or Liam Fox himself came out in favour of Trident and you know, and maintaining a strong nuclear defence capability. But I don't think myself it should be up to the Defence Minister. The Defence Minister should be there to implement the policy that the Cabinet agrees on and that ultimately the British people agree on. It is a democracy. It's up to us to say what we want our defence policy to be. And then we vote in the parties of politicians that then implement that policy. Surely that's how democracies work. Or did I miss something? Right? So anyway, there is an issue. What I don't think it should be up to is private lobbyists getting funding from abroad to then influence our defence policy, you know. And I would be very interested to see, for instance, if you could open access the archival materials of the lobbying history of this country, you know, who actually lobbied for nuclear weapons in the first place? Who were the foreign interests? What were the political and economic interests behind the nuclear weapons manufacturers who were then trying to sell that to the British people? Another question is, how much money have we spent as a nation over the last 50 years on these weapons? Have they ever been used? Obviously not, you know. So was that a good investment? You know, added up, it must be hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds. To do what? Just to, if the argument is it makes us look good at the big tables of the superpowers on the planet, I actually don't think it does. I think it shows up the poverty in our political thinking. Because to me, authentic morality is what buys you credibility around the planet, not you know, being the biggest bully on the block. Something that comes through the white paper, Tony Blair's wording, is very much, we need these things because we have to look good with the Americans, and they're our allies. I'm just reading between the lines here. Yeah, I love Americans. You know, I'm a North American myself by birth. But I don't think that cozying up to the biggest bully on the planet just as a way of getting influence is a moral thing to do. I think we need to distinguish between British foreign policy and defence policy and American. And I would also say that just as Britain might want to rethink its nuclear weapons policy, I think the States should. And if I was an American citizen, I'd be lobbying for that. You know, there needs to be a real rethink of what is America's power in the world. How is it projected? The American arms industry has spent billions and billions and billions, probably trillions of dollars on nuclear weapons in America. They have more than anyone else on the planet. Again, add up since 50 years of their existence, the total bill for that is trillions, right? What has that bought them? Are Americans better loved around the planet? Are they actually more influential? Is their economy flourishing? You know, are they feeling happier about themselves as a people? They were supposed to be God's nation, founded by pilgrims from Europe seeking spiritual freedom. You know, the Quakers helped set up, you know, Pennsylvania and so on, and the Puritans in New England. You know, what would they say? Has America fulfilled its mandate, or has it lost its way? You know, that's a political question. Anyway, let's look at who's opposed to these nuclear weapons. Interesting bunch of people. I mean, who'd have thought Dennis Healey and Michael Portillo would be found, you know, sharing the same platform? But both of them, one an arch Tory and the other an arch Labourite, both think this is a stupid thing to do, to have £100 billion spent on Trident. Obviously, we've got CND has continued its campaigning against Trident very creatively and intelligently. And that's not just in Scotland, Scottish CND, but also in Wales. And I've been in touch with the Welsh peace movement over many years. From their perspective, they think this is a stupid move. And also nationally, obviously, national CND. But in 2006, for instance, 20 bishops in the church claimed Trident was against God. So there we are, we've got theologians coming out. A physical argument I'll come back to a bit later. I mean, what that means, being against God, is something I'll address in a minute. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, also, Rowan Williams, has questioned the morality of replacing Trident. Okay, so I want to move on to the kind of next bit that's sort of coming towards the end, the ethical perspectives on all this. That's the kind of political debate, that's where we're at. So I want to speak now as a philosopher, ethical philosopher. Firstly, just more generally, backing off from the nitty-gritty political economic debate, let's go back up and look at the whole question of nuclear weapons as a phenomenon, right? I just would like to remind people they contradict just about every single ethical teachings on just war that have ever been debated or discussed by rational human beings, right? We humans have been doing wars since the Stone Age. But normally it was as an extremist. And it was normally for show and display, and it was a way of marking territory, like you were saying earlier about sacred boundaries. You know, somebody contradicts the sacred boundary, you have a little display of anger and stuff, and then they remember and go back. But it's very seldom that in primitive cultures that actual death occurs. Right? Amongst the anthropological studies of warfare that have been done, mostly it's brandishments for like showing off, right? And it's as technology's grown and increased that wars become much more bloody and more people die. You know, with the invention of iron, it increases. In the old Bronze Age, it was just warriors with big shields. You know, and obviously with the invention of armaments and guns and so on, the slaughter rates increased. The invention of the machine gun, mass killing, but it was still largely restricted to soldiers. The problem with nuclear weapons, the fundamental ethical principle behind just war theory in the church is that you don't kill non-combatants. You don't kill women and children, you don't kill non-combatants. Now, it's not possible to stick to that guideline and use nuclear weapons. Right? So according to Christian teachings, they are actually unethical and therefore immoral and therefore illegal according to God's law. If you look at it from an Islamic perspective, Islamic thinking on war is very, very long-standing debates have gone on among Islamic thinkers. The notion of jihad, which means struggle, is that in extremists you are allowed to fight in self-defense. If somebody's killing or attacking your city, you are allowed to fight in self-defense. Muhammad refused to fight in the very early stages of Islam. It was a kind of peace movement. The whole word Islam means peace, right? Surrender, submission to God. And his vision was that if everybody on the planet surrendered to God, we'd all be brothers and sisters. There'd be no need for wars because we've surrendered to the main man or the main goddess. But obviously, because warfare and violence were endemic, Muslims eventually were allowed to fight, but under very strict rules, and those rules involved non-killing of non-combatants, non-killing of women and children, non-destruction of environmental resources. You're not allowed to poison wells, chop down trees, destroy orchards in Islamic codes of jihad. So landmines, all that kind of stuff, out of order. And I'm a specialist on the history of Islam and Islamic philosophy, and I've argued with Islamic friends and colleagues, we need to bring back those Islamic teachings and actually do schools and training schools with people that are into jihad but don't know the rules. The suicide bombers are totally doubly against Islam because in Islam you're not supposed to kill non-combatants, which suicide bombers do, and you're not supposed to kill yourself. So suicide's out. So that's a double no-no, So this whole idea of going to paradise if you're a suicide bomber is completely non-Islamic. My friend Dr. Zaki Badawi, who I taught for in Islamic College in London, and I had long discussions about this, and basically he said, and he's an Islamic jurist from Al-Azhar University, that nuclear weapons are non-Islamic. They don't fit the bill. And it's interesting that very few Islamic countries have developed them, only Pakistan. And I think, Pakistan needs persuading. It's not a good idea. So I think so basically they contradict just war teachings in all the other religions too. I can give you the details if you're interested. The second thing I want to say about the ethical perspective is that, I mentioned this before, but today's conflicts are much more likely to be messy, low-level religious and cultural conflicts, like in the Balkans, like in Libya or Egypt we've just seen, like in Northern Ireland, like in Israel-Palestine. I mean, nuclear weapons cannot help solve these problems. Let's say we're statesmen and actually wanting to help solve conflict. And you've got a choice. You've got 100 billion quid in the kitty. You can invest it in nuclear weapons, or you can invest it in conflict resolution trainings and interfaith dialogues and genuine debate for peace among different religious and ethnic communities. I reckon you could solve these problems. Things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East and stuff. We could solve these problems with a millionth of the cost of Trident. And isn't that going to be actually in everybody's long-term interest, to get peace in the Middle East, rather than getting it going down the nuclear route? Frank Barnaby, an old friend of mine, wrote a book about nuclear weapons in the Middle East. Only Israel has them. But now Iran is trying to get onto the game, and everybody's afraid of that. You know, we could go down the route of the nuclearization of the Middle East, but how clever is that? You know, so I think investment, if Britain took a proactive peace-creating foreign policy route, instead of trying, you know, last worst-case scenario, end of the world, doomsday Armageddon route, which we've been addicted to, like a heroin fix, right? If we got a different kind of theology, which I would say is authentic Christianity at the basis of our foreign policy, and said, no, actually, we're going to help build peace in the Middle East and other cultural areas of conflict, it would be much, much cheaper. And I think we'd all get much better karma. The karmic dividends of the average Briton would increase. Much better investment. And so that money and energy could be put into non-violent training and education. You know, I do believe powerfully education can save this planet. It's the only thing that can. But it can't as long as there's no money in it. And students have to get into debt to study. You know, if we scrap Trident, I would immediately say all university placements are free. You get a grant, like in my days, in the 60s and 70s. You know, the youth of today should have the right to access the wisdom of previous generations freely. You know, and then in turn it's a torch that's passed on. They give it to their children in turn. You know, whereas we've got this sort of debt-based economy, bonkers. I want a grace-based economy, not a debt and guilt-based economy. You know, it's a grace to be alive. It's a gift we give to each other. Wonderful book on economics called The Gift, which looks at the role of gift giving in economics. It's the basis of all economic activity, actually, and that comes from love. So, you know, invest in love instead of mass killing makes sense to me. Then there's another argument. An ethical argument is that, well, all the others have these weapons, so we should have them too, right? I think this is a rather specious argument, if you think it through logically. Well, lots of other people have cancer, but does that mean I want it? You know, no. I mean, if something's wrong, it's wrong. And even if my best friend's doing it, I will actually try and talk them out of it. I think, you know, addiction to nuclear weapons is like a heroin fix, and it's foolish, you know? And just peer pressure. Somebody's got to step up and say, no, enough is enough. The other problem, the other ethical issue I'm concerned about is that nuclear weapons creates a police security state, surveillance, paranoia, you know, this sort of centralised secret state within a state. I mean, who actually polices the bases here on the Clyde? You know, is it American Secret Service? Who's actually in there? You know, who's in charge of these nuclear weapons? Do we know? I mean, I've just learned today over lunch that when the convoys bring up the weapons from, you know, down south near Aldermaston, they come through at the dead of night, and even the local councils and police aren't informed, right? So it's a sort of secret that these convoys are happening. And yet these are nuclear weapons being shifted throughout Britain that could, you know, go off by accident in some way if they crashed or whatever. So this is the sort of concern I have. And I just don't believe in secrecy in and of itself as a right and as necessarily a good thing. I do believe in public access to information and knowledge. I believe in public wisdom. As a philosopher, I love wisdom, and I want us all to have it. And that means access to information and knowledge, right? That's why we should all have free access to education. And I don't think we'll get, you know, peace on the planet till we open up access to wisdom again. And
as you had said that you wanted me to say something, I think you would kind of
you're prepared.
Respond.
Right, so I talked about the problem of the police state, the kind of security conscious thing. And that's a sort of false economy, isn't it? Because if you're spending money on security, but you're not actually generating the conditions of security. I think if we generate through moral goodness and virtue the conditions in a free democratic society where people, you know, choose morality, then you're creating those conditions in a way that you can't by negative, fear-based economics. I think that leads on to my next point, which is retaining nuclear weapons as a deterrent, to me, shows a total lack of faith in the power of moral goodness. I mean, many countries in the world don't have nuclear weapons. Finland doesn't, Sweden doesn't, Switzerland doesn't. Most countries don't. And nobody's sort of attacking them and throwing bombs at them. Normally people don't behave like that. Most people are moral. So to me it shows a great scepticism about reality, actually. If you're saying, well, in order to exist, I have to be able to threaten to destroy other people, what does that tell you about that thinking? To me, that's a kind of pathological way of thinking. I'm not sitting here because I know that I can kill my neighbour. I'm sitting here knowing I'm a good person, they're good people. Love your neighbour and love the source, God, or whatever you want to call it, that unites us in one great ecological, spiritual system. So I think we need a much more mature metaphysics than is exemplified by these nuclear weapons. And I think it's time in the third millennium now to really grow out of them. I do think they came in a historical time period of absolute terror. The Holocaust, we'd seen the horrors of World War II, genocide, a lot of Jewish scientists were involved in inventing these nuclear weapons. They were terrified of what was going on in Germany. And Einstein and people created the bomb in order to prevent Nazism spreading. They were terrified of it. They'd seen what it was doing. But those times are past. That historical moment is gone, right? We don't need to keep these horrible last remnants of that nightmare that was the 20th century. We can grow out of it into a new millennium. And I mentioned the Middle East dimension to this. I really don't want to see the nuclearization of the Middle East. That's a catastrophe. Because there's so much religious conflict and violence still there. Although Israel has nuclear weapons, as we know from Mordecai Vanunu and others, I don't think Israel would ever dream of using them unless, in a last case scenario, in the World Court Project, there was an attempt to get an international legal ruling on nuclear weapons, and it was sort of semi-fudged. It was found that they're illegal in international law, but they can be retained and used as a last resort if your nation is threatened with imminent destruction. That was the kind of fudged ruling, as I understand it. And that's how Israel justifies keeping them, because of their own fear. Now, what I'd argue, as the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Middle East, is that the long-term security needs of Israel could be met much better in a non-nuclear policy. And that if Israel, the idea of a nuclear-free Middle East makes a lot of sense to me. And even in the annex to the white paper in 2006 by the British government, they actually talk about a Middle East WMD-free zone. And this was something that the government is pursuing. So that debate needs to be had. And it's not just, if Britain were to begin to move away from its reliance on nuclear deterrence, then maybe it would encourage other countries to do so. But for that, we have to create the conditions of peace and security. And that's where the healing work comes in. That's what South Africa chose, the Truth and Reconciliation model. Somehow we have to heal these ancient divides and splits between different religious and cultural groups. I do believe that's possible. And if we invested in that, the educational work that's needed, the spiritual work, the training work. I used to teach students from all different parts of the Middle East, and still do. And Afghanistan, just had a few Afghans visit the castle here recently. Deep down, those people want peace, and I think we should be giving them the means to achieve that. Okay, I've mentioned the karmic dimension from an ethical perspective. To me, as a philosopher, moral philosopher, it doesn't make karmic sense to have these weapons of mass destruction as our primary argument for why people shouldn't attack us. That's ridiculous. We should be so nice they wouldn't want to attack us. It's called the love strategy. And if you think that's corny, I just refer you back to Christ. It was his idea. And it's supposed to be the idea underlying European civilization. But even before Christ, it was the Druid approach. Druids used non-violence in resolving conflicts. You know, they were sworn to non-violence, ahimsa. It's the Buddhist idea. Okay, here's the problem. Well, what about if, okay, so maybe the Cold War's over, but what about China? China's developing nuclear weapons. They have a massive hillside in China, like Coalport, they've just discovered. 30 miles of underground tunnels and stuff, where all their nuclear weapons are stored. China's quite aggressive. It's not been very nice to Tibetans. It had a pro-Taliban foreign policy. It had Bin Laden come to Beijing and sold the Taliban regime loads of weapons because it was playing power politics in Central Asia. It supported Pakistan and its nuclear program, sharing, you know, stuff. So shouldn't Britain retain nuclear weapons? What if, you know, China, this great new global superpower, doesn't show signs of being non-nuclear? So what if 50 years down the line, you know, China starts flexing its muscles against Britain? So should we not retain them? That's an argument, right? I don't really think that argument stands up, because I think deep down the Chinese people and Chinese civilization is also a peace-loving civilization. Their wisdom teachings, Confucian, Taoist teachings, you know, studied for many, many years. Even the Chinese communist tradition has an ethical component to it. There have been many great philosophers in China. And they talk about the levels of global citizenship. We have a duty to ourselves, to our family, to our community, but ultimately to the whole world. You know, Chinese ethics is quite strict on this. I don't think nuclear weapons stands under Chinese philosophy any more than it does under European or Christian or Islamic. But I do think that debate needs to be had, and I think we should be engaging with Chinese thinkers. And I think that the denuclearization, or the turning away from a nuclear weapons policy in Europe and Britain and so on, should be paralleled in East Asia. And I don't think there should be a sort of, sometimes the debate about economics is that economic power shifted from the West to the East, and China's always held up as the great model of power in the world. I think that's a kind of misunderstanding some of the things, and certainly in terms of ethical overviews, I think that moral responsibility to ensure that non-violence becomes the global currency, I think is preeminent. And so, you know, there needs to be, that problem needs addressing and debate held. The final ethical point I want to say is about the cost of accidents. You know, if nuclear weapons technology was totally benign and it was just like manufacturing videos and so on, fine, but it's not. It's extremely dangerous. It creates pollution long-term, which have enormous kick-on health effects, as we know from accidents that have gone on. And for instance, Dounreay in Scotland here is a stretch of coast that's forever going to be contaminated. Scottish Environmental Protection Agency has found that from 1963 to 84, so many millions of radioactive particles have leaked into the sea there. They will forever remain a threat to life and health. In France recently, 4 nuclear energy workers were blown up in an accident, just recently. In Japan, this last year, there's been a huge problem with a nuclear reactor leaking, which led to the evacuation of whole parts of Japan. I mean, the technology is not sufficiently sophisticated to be able to guarantee its own security and safety. So the ethical argument against relying on that for our weaponry, I think, is another reason to go against it. Okay, those are some of the ethical points I wanted to make. I want to finish, as a philosopher, I want to just comment finally on the kind of metaphysical side of this, right? Because this is the only institute in the world that deals with philosophy and peace. You can talk about the kind of strategic aspect of nuclear weapons in other places, but here's the only place we can talk about the philosophy behind it. I said earlier that, when we were having lunch, that nuclear weapons are a product of our cleverness as a species. We Homo sapiens are very crafty and clever. You know, we can talk, think, make stuff. And they come from our eating of the apple of knowledge. right? The scientists that invented this stuff are very clever. They get high on it. So that desire to know is very addictive, right? But you can't tell these people to stop being clever. Right now, as we speak, they're inventing new ranges and new generations of high-tech weapons, new types of nuclear weapons. It's very clever. But what I'm saying is that you can't ask people not to be clever, but you can ask them to be even cleverer, right? Because them using their minds for these instruments of mass death and destruction, at the end of the day, is not very clever. I mean, Oppenheimer, I've got his biography here, very clever man. He was the chap who masterminded the Manhattan Project. But, Einstein, who was cleverer than Oppenheimer, was clever enough to see the ethical dimension of knowledge. You see, the kind of mind that makes nuclear bombs is pigeonholed into a certain type of knowing. It can blow stuff up, but it can't think about the bigger context, the ethics. So to be cleverer than the Oppenheimer, you have to be an Einstein and see the context of knowledge, that it does bring ethical duties. So my argument is you can only replace false or partial knowledge with greater knowledge, not less. Now that's what Einstein said. He said you cannot unthink a problem with the same mindset that got you there in the first place. You have to think outside the box of what got you there. So if we're really going to get rid of these nuclear weapons, we have to outthink the people that created them. We have to be cleverer than them and wiser and more ethical. Okay, I don't think it's hard to do. So we need actually more science, not less. The kind of science that got us nuclear weapons, okay, it's clever, it's very sophisticated, it involves people tinkering around in labs. But we need more science to unthink them. So more research into free energy, less reliance on nuclear, more research on the fundamental physics behind the universe, quantum theory, more research on gravity, which I suspect eventually will be proved as a long-term energy source for mankind. For that we need new research in alternative cosmologies, things like plasma theory, challenging the conventional models. They've now discovered, European scientists at CERN, that some things move faster than light, right? That's a new discovery they've made. I mean, I think 100 years from now there'll be a totally different kind of physics being taught. It will involve faster than light, and it will probably involve consciousness. What we call consciousness will somehow be embedded in. And things like the film What the Bleak Do We Know explore the frontiers of quantum theory and consciousness. If you bring in consciousness, you bring in ethics. You can't tinker around with the fundamental building blocks of the universe and not bring in ethics and consciousness. And interestingly enough, the Duke of Argyll, who lived in Inverary Castle up the road in the 19th century, said exactly the same back then. He was a philosopher of science, who said that we human beings are embedded with the knowledge behind the universe. So self-knowledge comes into our science. So as a strategy, just metaphysically, I'd say we need what I call phenomenological detachment. Some people in this debate are very polarised. They're either really, really pro-nuclear weapons for it because they thought if it's a good thing, or they're really, really anti it and get really, really almost hysterically wound up. I think that what I would advocate as a philosopher of peace is we should rise above the debate, go to what I call phenomenological detachment, or epoche, suspend judgment, use reason. But one has to, if you retain the ethical commitment to peace, which is our fundamental duty as human beings, I think you will see that nuclear weapons actually aren't very clever. But not, we have to, as I've said, unthink them. Okay. And this is the logic of Nagarjuna, the great Buddhist philosopher, who said neither this nor that. Right? Truth is always beyond our current perception. So I think that if we each of us have a commitment to wisdom and the well-being of every person on this planet, we'll realise that nuclear weapons are not a very clever way to go. Another thing to say, metaphysically, is about the importance of ahimsa and non-violence. I run a school of non-violence, worked with the Gandhi Foundation organisation for many years, just had an award from India for non-violence educational work. To me, nuclear weapons represent the sort of final challenge to non-violence. If Gandhi was alive, Martin Luther King, Pythagoras, Buddha, you know, these are the great non-violence speakers of mankind. And outthinking the violence that gave birth to them is what we have to do. And that involves a whole rethinking of society and social relationships. In Britain, in August, I was on retreat on Iona, and I came back off Iona to discover England had gone up in riots. Places burning, kids chucking stuff into windows, some people dying. I was shocked to see this country. You know, I'm someone that lived in London, Brighton, England, Wiltshire. You know, I've taught in schools there, my degrees from the University of London. I love England, as I love Wales, Scotland and Ireland, and you know, everywhere. And so I set up a national task force on non-violence, which I've communicated to the Home Secretary, and I'm trying to work with youth leaders, community leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, to get thinking about non-violence in this country, the UK. I mean, I think it's shocking that this country sort of fell apart morally in August, and it was a wake-up call to many of us. Because non-violence, if nuclear weapons is the ultimate challenge to non-violence, right, then the basic challenge is how we relate to each other in a day-to-day level, as families, as friends, as workers, you know. And so I think this country seriously needs to look at itself and realise that non-violence isn't just something they do in India, you know, when they do spinning wheels. It's something we need to learn and master. And Britain has a history of violence. You know, we've exported wars, and you know, we need to. I would like to remake the history of this nation as a non-violence nation, ultimately. And that goes back to my commitment to the very ancient Druid path, which was non-violent. That's the authentic voice of this country. And I think it's time to stop the wars and get rid of these weapons. And I don't see why we couldn't have, for instance, a binding non-violence treaty with every other nation on the planet through the United Nations. Why can't Britain sign a treaty of non-violence with Russia, China, Greece, whatever? We won't attack you, you won't attack us. End of story. You know, get it signed, and that's it. Non-violence sort of wins. You know, the only people that wouldn't sign it are sort of rogue terrorist groups, but they're a problem anyway, and they're not going to be solved by having nuclear weapons. I think instead peace education and dialogue and, you know, moral education can help with that. So finally, metaphysically the problem is premised on what I call a false theology. Some people argue nuclear weapons are great. I've heard this argument, particularly in America, particularly in the Bible Belt. Nuclear weapons are great because that's God's wrath in action, because God wants the total destruction of mankind through judgment, because we've all fallen away from grace, and God's going to blow the world up through nuclear weapons. I find that such a shocking and tragic kind of theology, and so far away from any wisdom. But some people sort of believe that. You know, you're doing God's work by having nuclear weapons, because it's the last judgment coming, and because Christ's coming back, and he's going to judge the world, and, you know, only a few are going to be saved, the rest will be heaping rubble, smoking ruins. I mean, that, I think theologians all over the planet need to tackle that and unthink it. You know, it's not biblically based, it's not Christianity as I know it, it's not Judaism or Islam. It's a kind of pseudo-Zoroastrianism, if anything. Zoroaster taught that there was a struggle between Ahura Mazda, the god of light, and Ahriman, the god of death, and it's going to end in a final battle. But even in Zoroastrianism, the good side wins. Ahura Mazda eventually wins, helped by the Seishant, which is the origin of the Messiah, and then the good guys win, and life, you know, life carries on, the planet survives. So I think there's a lot of theological unpicking to do behind that notion of, you know, God wants nuclear weapons and war because it's judgment. It's a false reading, and I've proposed instead what I call the Golden Gate Project, which is that collectively mankind's spiritual leaders open the Golden Gate in the east wall of the old city of Jerusalem and let the light in collectively. That to me is authentic theology. It's a theology of peace, you know, and I'd love to kind of, to me these are the connected projects. And really, the last thing I want to say, the problem with that theology is it's denying the pagan heritage of revealed religions. Okay, the revealed religions, text-based, are sort of like the icing, last few thousand years. The pagan wisdom is much more ancient, 100,000 years, right? Not written down. And that's very much on the side of life. It's on the side of eros, on the side of human existence, and on the planet's existence. So the idea that God would want to destroy things as an act of wrathful judgment is very stupid. So I'm speaking here as an arch-Druid, that notion is ridiculous. And I think Poseidon himself, bless him, the god of the sea, or Manannan Maclear, as we call him in the Druid tradition, would be very sad if submarines and so on eventually that were swimming around his waters were ever used for this kind of mass destruction scenario. False theology. So I think there we are. That's my final metaphysical bit. Just a final thing to say about educational consequences. One is we can do things like the Poseidon Seminar. Bradford University has commissioned in its research institute a series of papers. They're working on a research program called Nuclear Armed Britain. And they've got some funding from the ESRC to specifically analyse the Trident replacement programme, which is excellent. But obviously places like Bradford don't go into the theological and philosophical and ethical side of that, which is what I'm addressing here.